Alright, here we are, talking about how French and the grammarians ruined English spelling. Most of the grammarians, but the French language had something to do with it as well. We'll get into it. Old English period was characterized by very few loanwords, three-part grammatical genders similar to German, a more complicated system of noun declensions, which went hand in hand with a more complex pronoun system, strong and weak verbs, conjugated very regularly depending upon which class they fell into, and all adjectives formed very simply using the ly suffix, which now we see uses more of an adverb suffix. Then, heading towards the Middle English period, we have the Irish Vikings picking a fight with the Frankish Empire. To clarify, the Vikings were not originally Irish people who became Vikings. They were Vikings who invaded Ireland and had settled there, and at some point decided that it was time to take on the Frankish Empire in northern France. So, they did that, and they ended up taking over what is now Normandy. Part of France now was its own thing for a while, and through that we end up eventually having William the Conqueror, who has a claim to the English throne and takes up on that claim and brings French into English in a large volume. Also at this time we have an important invention that hits England, and that is the printing press. This has a lot of implications heading into the Middle English era and has made some really lasting impacts on that. So, Middle English period, we see many loanwords introduced, especially Norman French, because again, French king comes in, brings French into the government, and it's Norman French. It's not polished, precise French like they speak in France nowadays. It's the Normanized, because the Vikings would do this. They would assimilate into the culture and start speaking the language, more or less. There was some mixture of some different, Norse and English, Irish language mixing, and so it became Norman French. It was not pronounced entirely the same way. Spelling standardization becomes a thing because of that printing press, and we lose letters like the thorn, and that leads to some spelling weirdness. Noun declensions start collapsing into mostly s plurals with a few n plurals surviving, and we have the rise of the his genitive, such as the king his sword, to say the sword belonging to the king but emphasize king. During this time also, England becomes the literary center of Europe. So, about those lost letters, here we have the thorn, which in Old English was the th and the sound, and the win, which in a lot of ways was the stand-in for what is now the y sound, had different sounds depending on whether it appeared at the beginning or end of the word, etc. But the printing press means that these look so similar, and there's not actually, they were runes, and so there wasn't a Roman alphabet typeset for that, and so they eventually both become put as Y, which leads to V looking more like ye. And so you have like ye olden store type thing. It never would have been pronounced that way. Also during this time we lose things like the long S, which you see here looks a lot like an F. We lose various sounds and therefore spellings, one or the other. Sometimes it's hard to tell which was lost first. Flash forward to the modern English period, and we have a pronoun system that eventually collapsed into the very few that we use today. We have apostrophes, a later effect perhaps of the printing press, and we have pretty much a loss of the his genitive. But that spelling thing, generally more exceptions now to the spelling rules than rule followers, in my opinion, as illustrated by this lovely poem called The Chaos, published in 1922, and we're not going to read the whole thing because it is very long, but I'm going to read just a little bit of you because you'll see the very similar spellings with completely different pronunciations. Dearest creature in creation, studying English pronunciation. I will teach you in my verse sounds like corpse, core, horse, and worse. And then we've got over here, pray console your loving poet, make my coat look new, dear, sew it. Just compare heart, hear, and heard, dies and diet, lord and word, sword and sward, retain and Britain, mind the latter how it's written. Maid has not the sound of bade, well now it does, back when this was written apparently it did not. Say said, pay paid, laid but plaid. And it goes on and on. And 46 stanzas later, we have the last little bit. I'll start over here. It's a dark abyss or tunnel, strewn with stones like Rowlock, Gunwale, Islington, and Isle of Wight. Housewife, verdict, and indict. Don't you think so, reader, rather? Saying lather, bather, father. Finally, which rhymes with enough. Though, through, bow, cough, huff, so, suff, tough. Hiccup has the sound of sup. My advice is give it up. Again, 46 stanzas between there. You can thank me later. But this very first stanza, we see some words, and they look like they should rhyme if it made any sense, but most of them don't, and the ones that do aren't spelled the same. So we've got verse from Old English verse. Notice the Latin there, and the spelling similarity there. Corpse and core both come from French. They both come from the same French stem, and yet in the latter, we don't pronounce that P. Also, that P had disappeared, you will notice, in French. In Old French, it had disappeared, and it reappeared both in modern French and in English because of that Latin stem, partially due to the grammarians. We'll get there in a second. Horse from Old English, pretty similar, just added an E. And Old English, look, we had different pronunciations and spellings for whether it was an adjective or an adverb. It wasn't that simplified. I like it. At this time we have, dun dun dun, the rise of the grammarians. As a side note, there were a few grammarians during the Old English period, just not that many, not that prevalent. But heading into the modern English period is when we have all these scholars, and we have the real rise of grammarians in society starting to impose rules prescriptively upon English. These men had a deep fondness for classical Greek and Latin texts such as Aristotle, Plato, all of the way back whens during the supposed heydays of culture. And while it's true that French, Spanish, Italian, and German all branched out of classical Greek and Latin in some ways, they didn't branch in the same ways. They were in a completely different branch, French, Spanish, and Italian, and German. However, according to the grammarians, all of the modern languages at this time were corruptions of the old classics. So we have things like debt, spelled the way we pronounce it in Middle English from French. And the grammarians add a B in there. Why, you ask? Because in Latin it's dub. And dub has a B. And that's not how we pronounce it in English, but they still felt the need to act as though this had come from Latin, when in fact it had not. It's kind of the same mentality shown in this comic, the I before E except after C with hieroglyphics. Doesn't make much sense. So English is gaining rules. We've got splitting infinitives has been forbidden, double negatives get exiled, shall and will are forced apart. We've got a few in plurals that barely survive, and why all this change? Well, because logic, supposedly. You can't split a Latin infinitive. It's one word, whereas in English it's two words. It's two plus a verb. In English, it usually had been perfectly acceptable, and we're getting back to it being perfectly acceptable, to split that apart and say two da-da-da-da-da make, and it'd be fine. But they said since you can't do it in Latin, it's obviously an abomination to do it in English. Double negatives get exiled. Double negatives show up in most languages in the world today still. I ain't got nothing to prove, things like that. They're seen as slang, they're seen as impolished in English because of the mathematical logic that a negative plus a negative equals a positive. So if you're not doing something, then you're doing it. Not the way the language was used at all. Commonly the way that it's explained doesn't make sense. Shall and will are forced apart because John Wallace, who was a geometry professor, had his own view of emotional overtone and emphasis and said that shall and will should be used in completely different context, and it depended upon it was I or we, shall, will, whatever, or you, he, she, them being used, and it flip-flopped. You can see why this didn't stick very well, I think. In plurals, like children, survive, but a lot of them become S plurals. Why? Because Shakespeare needed iron the plural of eye to rhyme with skies. So next we have English as it stands today, and you see how much of that has been influenced by Latin and French. You see how much of it is still from the Germanic languages, and some of this Latin and French mixture has been the superimposed rejoining etymologically of Latin into words that were not originally Latin or that had become something different. Is it too late? Unfortunately, it is kind of too late to adjust spelling, so all that is left is to deeply resent the grammarians and the French language for the way that they have forever altered our language. Some mistakes cannot be unmade, and some prideful, arrogant thinking that we know how language ought to behave cannot be undone when it's been set into motion over the course of centuries. My disclaimer is here. No grammarians were harmed in the making of this presentation, only a piece of paper, and I didn't burn the house down. But I hope that this gives you a little bit more insight into how and why English spelling is the way it is, and who we have to blame for that, or complain about, even though they can't hear us. Now all that's left is to make the best of what we have, and English overall is a very beautiful language. It's just crazy hard to learn how to spell.